This is Charter Local Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, and we are joined by Raphael Sonenshein. He is the executive director of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles. I grew up in the Los Angeles area, and Tom Bradley was a towering figure in my memory. I remember my parents talking about Tom Bradley. Give us a sense of the man. Who was this man? And we're talking about it because a film is being released soon called Bridging the Divide, talking about Mr. Bradley.
Well, Tom Bradley was a remarkable historical figure. Many think the greatest mayor in the history of Los Angeles.
Really?
Well, he was really the man who made this a modern city. LA had been kind of a small town with a large population.
I see.
Very quiet, out of the mainstream of many national political debates, quite conservative, and not very open to the diversity of the community. And Tom Bradley blew all that open and really made this a major global metropolis with an eye toward incorporating diverse groups in a period when race was at the center of public debates in the United States.
So he was mayor from 73 to 93.
5 terms. Yes.
5 terms. And so give us a sense of Los Angeles in 1973 when we look at race relations, and then we'll talk about 1993.
In 1973, race relations were much better in Los Angeles. I have to go back 4 years before when he ran for mayor in '69, when the entire country was racked by racial conflict. And he lost a race to Sam Yorty, the incumbent mayor, who ran a vicious race-baiting campaign against Bradley, accused him of being, in effect, a Black Panther.
Really?
And for those who knew Tom Bradley, of course, that's a fairly laughable characterization, but the voters, especially the majority of white voters, bought that argument, and it was a devastating defeat. 4 years later, people knew Bradley much better.
Why?
They knew him as a person. He continued campaigning after the '69 race. And as people got to meet him, they discovered he was a thoughtful, intelligent, careful guy who made the argument that he could be a much better mayor than Sam Yorty, and people turned their back on Yorty.
So how did he do it? What was the coalition? We hear about it, but really give us a sense. What was that coalition?
The core of the coalition was African Americans who were heavily mobilized around Bradley, and white liberals, especially Jewish voters, who were overwhelmingly in favor of Tom Bradley.
Why?
Because they shared liberalism, and this was a strange kind of city. This was a city that was hostile to almost everybody who was an outsider. It was fairly hostile to blacks, to Jews, to Latinos, to Asian Americans. So there was a real feeling of the outsiders coming in. So Jewish voters, who in New York City were very much on the inside, were on the outside in LA. So a combination of liberalism and shared outsider status.
And there was enough Jewish voters combined with African American voters to put him over the top.
There were. Jewish voters were never more than about 7% of the city. African Americans were never more than 18% of the city. Now they're about 9%. But Jewish voters would turn out at roughly 3 times that percentage. So as much as 18% of the vote was cast by Jewish voters until recent years. And African Americans voted at high levels. So what you needed was Latino voters, and a majority of Latinos came around to Bradley in '73.
Small numbers, no?
Small numbers, but it still was enough.
You added it all up.
And you added it all up, and white Democrats, and especially young voters, turned toward Bradley, and all that made him able to get about a 53% majority.
I want to talk about '93 in a moment. First, I want to talk about his run for governor. I was old enough to remember that he was going to be governor. I mean, the 1982 election, he was 10 points ahead. What happened?
To this day, there's argument over this. There's something called the Bradley effect that was invented to explain what happened, that he was ahead in the polls going into the election and then lost. And one theory is that a lot of white voters who said they were undecided actually had decided, especially Democrats, to vote against Bradley. But there were other factors. There was a gun control measure on the ballot that mobilized the gun owners in the northwest counties of the state. In Yolo County, the turnout was around 91%, as I recall. And the Republicans, for the first time, used an absentee ballot campaign. And that meant that when you did exit polls, at the polls, you were missing the absentee voters who voted overwhelmingly for Duke Majan. So some mix of race, gun control, and political organization. I also have to say that I always thought that Tom Bradley's heart was in being mayor of Los Angeles. And I never thought that his dream was to be governor. His dream was to go as far as his ambition could carry him. And the next step, of course, I think he would have been a very good governor. But when he campaigned for mayor, you knew that he knew every nook and cranny of that city government, having been a police officer, a city council member. So it would have been a big change to be governor. I'm still sorry he didn't get the opportunity.
Right. So 1993, he does not run for re-election, but we had just come off a very difficult year in terms of race relations. Did that tarnish his 20 years of work?
It would have, except for one thing. If you've ever heard that famous thing, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times,
Sure.
from Dickens.
Right.
Essentially, 92 and 93 were also the greatest achievement of Tom Bradley, because Proposition F in 92 brought civilian accountability to the LAPD for the first time in the history of Los Angeles. It's the reason why today you can talk about firing or hiring a chief and holding the chief accountable. The civil disorder of 1992 was a catastrophe for Bradley and his legacy, and police reform was the crown jewel. So if you want to talk about a good and bad ending,
Sure.
put those two things together.
So now we're about 20, 22 years off of his tenure. What's your sense of race relations today? And it's a very different Los Angeles than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Well, today it's much more of a kaleidoscope of multiple groups. For Bradley, for a long, long time, it was black and white. Had to cross the bridge between African Americans and whites. But now, because of immigration changing the nature of the city, the rise of Latinos, the rise of Asian Americans, it's now one of those chess games now that has to be played in 3 or 4 dimensions. So there's no single answer anymore to how it's going. There's very great difficulties economically. Groups are in political competition. But one thing that has stayed in people's mind is the Bradley model of coalition still sits in the back of people's minds, whether they're Latino, Asian American, African American, white, or Jewish, whatever.
So let's look at current mayor Eric Garcetti. What did his coalition look like? And I mentioned that he is half Latino, half Jewish, which is kind of an interesting combination.
It's quite a combination. And as the previous mayor, Antonio Villaraigosa, both of them got very strong support in the Latino community. Struggled a bit in the African American community. In fact, Wendy Gruhl did very, very well. Well, I think her historic ties to Tom Bradley and some competition still politically between Latinos and African Americans. But I must say, not the kind of conflict that there had been between blacks and whites in the Yorty Bradley years. More of a competitive thing. And also, Garcetti did very well with Jewish voters and with many white voters. Now, he's been improving his relationship with the African American community, and certainly Villaraigosa did that during his term. The future of the city, in many ways, is going to be determined not so much by black-white relationships, but the relationships among those 3 communities, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. And I think it's very important.
So let's talk about the rise of the Latino voter and elected official. Elected-wise, Latinos have done very well, generally speaking. The Latino population is not voting, though.
This is the problem. Now, let me give you some numbers, Brad. In 1993, when Richard Riordan was elected mayor, 8% of all votes were cast by Latinos. When Antonio Villaraigosa was elected in 2005, 25% of all votes were cast by Latinos.
One of their own,
but that was a high watermark. And those numbers have dropped, not all the way back.
What about Mr. Garcetti?
Mr. Garcetti, the turnout share is not quite what Antonio Villaraigosa was getting. Now, this is a big problem for Latinos because as a working class and middle class community, their clout is going to depend on mobilizing the vote. And there's a lot of concern. You know that in the last November 14 election, LA County had the lowest turnout of any county in the state, 31%.
You'll come back.
Of course,
I'd love to have you back.
We always enjoy talking.
His name was Raphael Sonenshein. He is the executive director of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles. I'm Brad Pomerance. It's Charter Local Edition.